And can people just see the slide rather than any notes or anything?
Yeah, that's all we can see, Alex.
Grand. I've finally worked out how to use Zoom, PowerPoint and Zoom together. So, success. I guess I'll start then, just to give an overview of what's happening in this part of the UK Federation Town Hall Week. We've got 2 sessions here. The first one that I'll lead on, which is about entity attributes in the UK Federation. And the second one, in about half an hour, is a publisher roundtable, Ask Anything. And that is kind of 2-way questions or whatever, which is publishers can ask us and ask the attendees, and conversely, the attendees, if we have questions for the publishers that are here, we're hoping we can have questions for anyone, from anyone. And tomorrow is the penultimate part of the town hall. We've got 2 sessions for you. First is delegated authentication. By John Agland will be presenting that. I presume that's delegated authentication with a focus on the Shibboleth IDP's method of delegating authentication.
Just to jump in there, Alex, yes, it'll be me and John are talking about yeah, doing that sort of delegating the authentication from the IDP off to somewhere else, particularly Azure, but it's a general case as well.
Right, thank you. Are you doing the readiness for Shibboleth v4 IDP as well?
John's doing that one, I'm doing the delegated auth one.
Right, okay, thanks very much. So I think I'll just crack on with the with this today, me. So the structure of the session, maybe a little bit of formality, saying what are the entity attributes. We'll do some simple examples that should be familiar to all of you. Those are mostly for IDP operators, and then we'll look at some of the more complex entity attributes that are in play at the moment. Actually, all of these entity attributes, they'll affect IDPs and SPs differently. So I'll try and bring those out as we go through. And I encourage you to stop me, to unmute yourself and say and provide your input here. The success stories for how, as an IDP operator or as an SP operator, you have been able to work with these entity attributes, and also any barriers to adoption. It would be good to hear those as well. I've also put links up on the UK Federation website, which has links to all of the, well, maybe not all of them, but a lot of the definitions and our user-facing documentation and so on. I've just put that link in the chat window, so if you do want to have a look at those, and you know, you'll have access to all our documentation and so on. So that's there. Oh, and after those kind of more complex entity attributes, I thought I'd put a couple of problems up. And as I was finalising this session, the talk for this, I thought, well, maybe there's some conundrums. And then I looked up and I thought, is that the right word? Looked online and found, you know, conundrums, it's both an intricate and difficult problem. It's also a question or problem having only the conjectural answer. And it turns out 2 of the problems that I'll get to towards the end of the session, you know, one is the first definition and the second one is the second definition. So that's where we're heading. But we will start out with, well, this formal part, some easy examples, and then the more complex situations. And formally, entity attributes are part of your entity SAML metadata. So traditionally, you would have had web service endpoints and maybe a display name and some contacts. Somewhat later, we got to certificates, and entity attributes are relatively, well, they were defined in 2010, so somewhat after the SAML metadata specification. But they are a way of adding names and values to your entity's attributes. You can categorize your entity. You can say it's an IDP that belongs to a certain category, and some may be prescriptive, that have certain requirements sorry, your entity must meet those requirements in order to assert the entity attribute. So the entity categories, yeah, we can categorize entities into having those particular characteristics. There's also an entity category support, which is that a relying party of that entity recognizes, consumes that entity attribute, recognizes it, changes its behavior because of that, because it sees that entity category. And the third entity attribute we see most of is the assurance profile. And this is, well, from the specification, I'll just read out from that. It says, many organizations using federated service access have found it useful to define or adopt identity assurance frameworks. And this allows a model for categorizing the number of possible combinations of registration processes, security mechanisms, authentication methods. So it's a way of combining that kind of multiplicity of organizational processes into a few different categories. It's often called levels of assurance, although that implies a kind of layered approach, although it's more a mix and match. One doesn't necessarily have a second level, which is in all aspects more rigorous than a first level. So those are the three kind of entity attributes that we see in the UK Federation and in Edugain at the moment. And they're part of the trust fabric. They're part of that SAML metadata. Some of them can be self-asserted. Some of them require an element of checking before the Federation operator can add that to the registration. And they, oh, pardon me. And they also, the motivation for them is that they allow scalability of the system, that one can configure one's entity to react to an entity category. It offloads some of that checking to a federation operator or the entity owner themselves. And one could say that, for example, attribute filtering, one will always send a particular attribute to entities that are categorized a particular way, or like that. I'll move on to the next slide. Oh, I should just mention as well, the Shibboleth IDP has a particularly sophisticated part of that. It has attribute filters that you can define. There's entity attributes, you can match on those exactly or as a regular expression. So a couple of kind of familiar examples. The first one is hide from discovery, where back in the a precursor to the UK Federation, there was a need for someone trying to access a service to say where do you come from, and SPs would at that point would offload their discovery. I feel that happened more often than not. But nevertheless, one needed a way to hide some IDPs from that discovery service. Perhaps they were test IDPs or IDPs being commissioned. Potentially they might have been inoperable, there might have been some issue with that. But there needed to be some way to hide those. and the SDSS, in the SDSS federation is hide from waif. XML element was defined. This is 4 years before entity attributes were standardized. So over time, the formal definition of SAML has progressed, that we could move away from a UK Federation specific element to something that was internationally defined and recognized. And then from about 2017 to 2018, we migrated how we handled this internally and how we published information about hide from discovery. And that took some time to migrate across from a UK specific thing to an internationally recognized part of metadata. The second one that IDP operators will, I hope, be familiar with is this notion of accountable users. And so this is another UK Federation specific thing that was defined. I'm not sure exactly when it was defined. It was in the first UK Federation schema in 2008, and it would have been defined before then, but I haven't been able to uncover that. There are people that I'm sure would know that, but I wasn't able to get that for this talk. The point about the accountable users is it is an assurance by the IDP operators that certain organizational, that the organization follows particular practices. So it has a documented process for issuing credentials. The IDP must retain sufficient logs that if a service provider comes and says there's some suspected abuse, can you find out who this account belongs to? So there's those behavioral expectations on IDPs which assert accountable users. And I suppose a heads up for people is that internally the UK Federation is looking to move from something UK Federation specific to something that is an assurance certification under the entity attributes. Expressed as an entity attribute. And we think there's only a couple of service providers that that actually use the accountable users element, some that were in the early days of the UK Federation. So we're hopeful that this will not be a large refactoring in terms of the actual the SPs themselves, but the number of SPs. So that's us at about 1:15. So having moved from the kind of definitions and a couple of easier examples, I'll move to the first of 3 entity attributes that we support. And the first one is the Géant Data Protection Code of Conduct. And this is formally for service providers in the EU or EEA or some other countries as well. And this is for SPs to assert that they observe good practice when handling attribute data. The actual code of conduct itself is from 2013, so it's pre-GDPR. And it's a code of conduct that a lot of these good practices, I think, have been incorporated into GDPR at the moment. So there's things like data minimization, there's purpose limitation, there's transfer of data to third parties. So this is within the Data Protection Code of Conduct specification. So those are the good practice guidelines that SPs will self-assert that they reach, and there are also a couple of metadata requirements that we can and do test on. So we ensure that the SP has a privacy statement URL, which resolves, certainly at the time of registration, to a document that has a number of things, that there's a commitment to the code of conduct, the jurisdiction, the address of the organisation, the purpose of the attributes, and so on. I think this last part is a little bit out of order, because I suppose I wanted to say why what IDPs should do to that. But just as a little digression, that the SP is, the code of conduct, pardon me, is only for SPs that reside in particular jurisdictions. And we don't know what will happen towards the end of this year. We don't know what will happen with adequacy agreements and so on. So there is a certain amount of exposure that SPs in the UK Federation, which currently assert this SP data protection code of conduct. There are 9 of those. A couple of them are student services. 6 of them are kind of professional services, in the sense that there's one which manages research assets. There's DMP, which is data management plans, just as a community site, and so on. So yeah, we have some exposure to that as Brexit progresses, but I think we need to deal with that on a case-by-case basis. I think what is more generally applicable is how IDPs are able to interact with this data protection entity attribute. So IDPs can support this, and they can indicate that in metadata with an entity category support value. And the specification, it talks about willing to interact with service providers. Well, first of all, the code of conduct is purely a code of conduct. It doesn't have a weight of a legal agreement. And secondly, even within it, it just says willing to interact, which is not, which doesn't require, it can't require that the IDP will release attributes. And furthermore, sorry, pardon me, I omitted the thing about the requested attributes on the previous slide. One of the requirements for the code is that the SP puts certain elements in metadata, or has that registered, saying what are the requirements, what identifier does it need, what additional attributes, which of these are required or not. Now, the code can't require an IDP to release them. I mean, what it can do is it show that the SP will behave well when it receives those. And I think this boils down to the operational value of the data protection code of conduct, as far as I see, is that it requires that the SP has requested attribute elements and a privacy statement URL. So as an IDP operator, if one wants to interoperate with the SP that has the code of conduct, you can look in the metadata for the privacy statement and the requested attributes, and see whether the privacy statement, whether the policy is consistent with your own organization's data protection policy, and can view the requested attribute elements to configure your IDP. And I think Neil was asking about that on Monday. So I don't know whether he is on the call, or whether that is a suitable answer for that kind of question, to his question. But I think that's, I mean, I'm hoping that's not contentious. I think there is value in the data protection code of conduct, but I don't think it makes requirements on attribute release for your organisation.
I think Neil is on the call. If he wants to pipe up at all, we're welcome to have people ask questions verbally as well.
Sorry, just trying to find the unmute on. Don't usually use this. Yeah, I just wonder, so you're basically saying, okay, it's in the metadata, but we shouldn't automatically handle requested attribute elements. We still manually have to check their code of conduct and decide whether we're going to allow those requested attributes.
Yes, I think so. I mean, I had a chat with the UK Federation, well, with Mark and the help desk staff this morning, and I think that's what we think is the advice for that.
Okay.
We don't make it.
Sorry, I'm also a bit surprised that there's a lack of privacy statement URLs in the from service providers that you mentioned.
We don't make it mandatory.
Yeah.
I mean, perhaps we should emphasise that. I mean, that. And I mean, yeah. We also, I don't think, have anywhere that has an easily viewable place where we say, you know, or provide for IDP operators that says, you know, look at this service. What are its requested attributes? What is its IDP? And maybe we're just expecting that people should dig through the XML. I don't know whether that's a good expectation or whether we should think about putting something a bit more web-based, you know, some kind of web-based monitoring on that. Maybe not monitoring. I'm not sure how many privacy statement URLs we have registered. It's not a large proportion. So I will look at that and see if there's things that we can do to increase that proportion. So moving on from the data protection code of conduct, we support an assurance certification called Sirtfi, unrolling that to a security incident response trust framework for federated identity. And this is a framework that, once again, is self-asserted with some metadata requirements. And the assurance certification was developed. I think there's a dozen or 15 authors from federation operators, from research infrastructures, from large service providers, and they've looked at the security requirements and they've codified some of the good practices out there. Collated some of the good practices out there into 4 kind of areas. And operational security covers things like running up-to-date software, maintaining patches, monitoring for vulnerabilities, so on. Incident response covers things like having an organization, having an incident response function within your organization which has sufficient authority to respond to an incident. And is willing to share information, or appropriately share information, and so on. Traceability is the keeping of logs, and I guess there's observability in there, and the participant responsibility sections as well have there are a number of elements within that. And as well as those organizational behaviors, the assurance certification also requires a security contact to go into metadata, and the UK Federation supports that. We encourage you to use a kind of role-based email rather than emails that go just to individuals. Well, one of the things that the full Sirtfi assurance certification requires is that security contact and the incident response team follow the traffic light protocol for information sharing. And one thing that I don't know is that I don't know how widely used and followed this traffic light protocol is within the UK Federation. We have had some pushback from organisations saying that they have an incident response function, but it doesn't follow this. It follows their own internal procedures. And we have also had other organisations which have certified that they do have this and they do follow the traffic light protocol. So certainly one thing that I don't understand is how prevalent that is within the UK Federation. And that, I guess, leads us on to the first of the conundrums, which is the one that's is more conjectural, is that we have a development internationally about baseline expectations, and in the short term, I don't think we're looking to go to. I don't think that this will require the full Sirtfi list of the full Sirtfi certification. But I think that there are strong arguments there that this will be a requirement for participating in EduGain. And if, well, I'll also explain in terms of phases of this. So the first one is that the talking about the baseline expectations is happening within RefEds at the moment, which is purely talking and discussing and talking about behavioural expectations, but that has no power to require anything. If things are formalised there and agreed on within RefEds, there is a possibility that these could go to EduGain and become a technical profile and become things that are testable in metadata, and one can make decisions on whether to allow or to deny entities into EduGain. So that's how the kind of specifications might flow. And there's also an intermediate kind of stage as well, where people are discussing whether a first step might be that entities that wish to interoperate internationally just have a security contact, and sometime later on, when a second one of these baseline comes out, then that will mandate Sirtfi. And like I said before, I don't understand how prevalent the traffic light protocol is. I don't understand whether IDP operators would want to do this, and would very much like to hear feedback from organisations that have done or are reticent to do it. And we recognise that this might not be the place to talk about it because we're, recording over Zoom. So we're also, UK Federation is also willing to facilitate somewhere where we can have a bit more of a discussion that is away from this kind of thing, and maybe run it under Chatham House rule or whatever. So I don't know if we can get, is there a way to get the feeling of the mood of the participants, whether we need more information sharing about Sirtfi or not? No, but it looks like there's no one who's kind of raising their hand in the participant list and so on.
I've just tried to run up a poll, Alex. So if people want to do that while we're going, so
yeah, fair enough. 50-50 at the moment. Fantastic.
Yeah. It'll be 52-48, I guarantee you.
Yes. Right, well, maybe I'll just kind of move on to the next one, which is there's a certain amount of contention with that as well, which is the research and scholarship entity category, and this is for the SPs that facilitate collaboration, and they require some personal data to provide the effective service. And then this can't be self-asserted. There has to be that the federation operator has to make a judgment whether that is the case. And we do have a process for that we assume that within, or we talk to the management contact who is registering an entity with research and scholarship. If they come from the education community, from a higher education provider, we will assume that they serve the higher education community. It provides that, it enhances the research and scholarship activities. For commercial organisations, we do require a sponsorship from a higher education provider, or I suppose any education provider. And we don't have a huge uptake of this so far with 9 SPs, and there are 238 imported from other federations. And this is, once again, I'm a little bit out of order in the sense that maybe I should have said what the attribute requirements are for research and scholarship. And for IDPs that assert they support RNS, that for a subset of the user population that you must release a particular attribute bundle which has an identifier, a name and an email address. And name and email are I hope they're uncontentious. That seems to be the amount of information one would release if one was sending an email to a service provider saying, can I have a login here? It also, by having name and email asserted by the IDP, that provides a certain amount of assurance that these are name and email addresses associated with that account. Within the UK Federation, however, eduperson principal name is something that is not widely used, would require, it may have personal information in it, and would require some process to see whether one could release that. Also, the actual specification itself, I think, I don't think it does well defining what are the attribute, what identifier it needs. It kind of goes around in, it talks about a combination of EPPN and targeted ID. And it also isn't future-proof for the SAML subject identifiers, which are kind of coming in at the moment.
We've got a couple of questions in chat as well, Alex.
Yep. Okay. I can't answer Mark's question, which is how and where does Sirtfi differ from the established JISC CSIRT procedures? And he suspects there is a lot of overlap, and I think probably the traffic light protocol has come out of the kind of CSIRT community, and Janet was part of the organisations that first defined this. So I think that the process is certainly that organisational process is familiar within CSIRT. but I'm not familiar with these processes, so I can't answer that. I don't know if anyone else from JISC is able to. Yeah. No. So Peter from Bath Spa University, for an RNS where a commercial use requires sponsorship from an IDP, could you share any examples of how this is working, how it might work in theory? Well, we have one example of this, which is the is it Calpendo No, Calpendo is the organization and it's the Exprodo software. The SP has asked for research and scholarship, says it enhances the research and scholarship functions. It provides an asset management, a research facility management tool, and requires that kind of name and email. And we have asked for sponsorship from an HE organization to say that they are happy that the commercial software provider does in fact enhance that for the wider community. I mean, we're still going through that. They said, well, yes, we do. We can say this informally, but it's a bit difficult in the time of COVID to get this formally done. So we're still formally going through that process to record it, but we do have that process in place. I don't know, Mark, if there's anything you want to add to that.
No, I think that summarizes it, Alex.
Okay. And then Robert and Scott have talked about the values of education scoped affiliation. And I don't know, I mean, we've not done a survey of our, I think one of the things that research and scholarship says in the spec is that if you would require particular values, they should be in the requested attribute. No, sorry, that's, pardon me, that's the code of conduct one. Sorry. I guess if research and scholarship SP as well as code of conduct is in there, you could probably answer that question, but no one does. Kenny has asked, can I discuss what subset of user population is? This is something that is a bit of a, I think this is a moving target, and I think this is something where the RNS specification isn't brilliant. So the RNS specification, the entity attribute is a particular URI, should be stable. However, the definition underneath it has changed somewhat. So early versions, early versions were saying for a subset, some subset of the user population, which we interpreted to be, at least one user. The later version of RNS said for a significant subset. And reasonable set of people such as all students, all staff, all faculty. But obviously didn't want to say a numerical majority or something like that. And I don't think we have a federation-wide recommendation. I don't know whether we would want to do that. Would we want to do that? Right. And I think the last one that's not really been answered there is a filtered feed of what SPs require support RNS would be useful. Yeah, we thought about doing, this is from Mark in Edinburgh, we thought about doing a ticker of what RNS SPs are. We haven't done it so far. There's been quite a lot of interest in RNS in the time of COVID as well, where research providers are or research instructors are refocusing on that. And just to jump backwards a little bit, in March 2020, RefEd's, following in Commons' lead, I think, put out a call for IDPs to support RNS, even with the flaws that are in it. And since that, in March 2020, over 100 IDPs have now said that they will support do support the RNS tag. And I think this gets to the kind of a second conundrum, which is that some research infrastructures, I mean, actually we're now at 22, so I think I would not want to get into this, because I think this could be a can of worms, and it would be good to wrap up and pass over to the second part of this session. This is certainly something that the 56 to 44% in the poll, so certainly not an overwhelming amount of people who want to have or feel that we should have a second or another forum. But we can still explore that and gauge the interest in it later. And I guess, quick ask if there are any other questions that people have